All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to explore that totally fascinating and honestly super frustrating gap between knowing a language's rules and actually being able to speak it seamlessly. If you've ever studied a second language, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You totally ace the written grammar test, but the second you step into a cafe to order a coffee, all those rules just vanish. Well, today we are going to unpack exactly why that happens and how we can fix it, drawing on some truly brilliant research into instructed second language acquisition and the cognitive science of sentence processing. You know the feeling, right? Have you ever completely frozen mid-sentence while desperately trying to remember the right verb tense? It is a universally frustrating experience. You know the vocabulary, you've memorized the conjugation tables, yet under the pressure of real-time conversation, your brain just hits a brick wall, and you literally forget how to say hello. So, here's our roadmap to figure out exactly why this happens. First, we'll look at the language learning puzzle. Then, implicit versus explicit learning, followed by the science of automatization, measuring speed and fluency, and finally, we'll wrap up with collaborative language learning. Okay, starting off with section 1, the language learning puzzle, because researchers have spent decades trying to figure out how to make language instruction actually stick when students leave the room. Now, researcher Harumi Kamura points out something really interesting here. Just stockpiling grammar rules and vocabulary, yeah, that doesn't actually make you fluent. In fact, a traditional classroom focus that overemphasizes perfect accuracy can completely backfire. It often makes learners incredibly anxious, especially in test-heavy cultures. And that anxiety directly hinders the active, spontaneous participation you actually need to develop fluency. I mean, if you're terrified of making a mistake, you're just not going to speak. Which brings us right to our second section, implicit versus explicit learning. This is a massive debate in second language acquisition. Basically, we're contrasting explicit instruction with implicit learning. Think of explicit instruction like consciously reading a driving manual. You're super aware of the rules, it's very effortful, and it takes time to process. Implicit learning, on the other hand, is like effortlessly navigating traffic. It's unconscious, it happens without you even thinking about it, and it's completely ready for spontaneous communication. The problem we run into is that most language classes focus heavily on the manual, but real life requires navigating the traffic. So how do we actually bridge that gap? Well, skill acquisition theory, as noted by researcher Robert de Keyser, says we have to proceduralize our knowledge. We have to transition from just stating a rule, like explaining how to form the past tense, to actually using it freely in the wild. And this doesn't happen by magic. It requires massive amounts of input and plentiful opportunities for practice, so that this conscious knowledge slowly transforms into an unconscious reflex. Let's look at how our brains actually pull this off in Section 3, the science of automatization. A fascinating study by researchers Yuichi Suzuki and Midori Sanada looked right under the hood of second language sentence processing. It reveals the brain's ultimate goal here, automatization. See, smooth communication isn't just one big monolithic skill. It relies on complex, heavily coordinated lower-level subskills. We're talking incredibly fast lexical retrieval, grammatical parsing, and the actual physical articulation of sounds. All of these have to fire together perfectly. When these subskills do fire seamlessly, you achieve automatization. That basically means you've restructured your mental processes to completely bypass those clunky routines, like silently translating a sentence from your mother tongue before speaking. It becomes fast, effortless, and ballistic. And here's the absolute kicker. Because it's unconscious, it frees up your very limited working memory, allowing you to actually focus on the meaning of the conversation instead of the mechanics of the grammar. So, how do we test this? That brings us to Section 4, measuring speed and fluency. Scientists capture this invisible mental shift using something called the maze task. It's a computerized test measuring reaction times as participants rapidly choose correct words to build an entire sentence. Imagine seeing two words on a screen. One makes grammatical sense to continue the sentence, and the other just doesn't. You have to click the right one under immense time pressure, word by word, until the sentence is finished. It forces the learner to constantly predict and incrementally build sentences, which mirrors the real-time, sweaty palm demands of an actual conversation. Now, researchers look at two distinct metrics from this task to figure out what's happening in the brain. The first is reaction time, or RT. That's just sheer speed. How fast are you clicking? The second is the coefficient of variance, or CV. This measures the stability of that speed. In cognitive science, genuine automatization isn't just about doing the clunky translation process faster. It's about restructuring the brain to bypass that clunky process entirely. If you've genuinely restructured your processing, your speed becomes highly stable, which shows up as a specific change in your CV. So, what actually predicts how well a student can speak? Surprisingly, Suzuki and Sonata's data shows that for your typical classroom learner, sheer speed, just getting faster at those clunky routines, is actually a much better predictor of speaking proficiency than genuine automatization. For standard learners who only study in a classroom, the CV metric barely correlated with their oral skills at all. Mere speed up was the real driving force behind their fluency. In fact, when the researchers dug deeper, they found something wild. Learners only showed signs of genuine cognitive restructuring, that true, stable automatization measured by CV, after an average of 15 months of total immersion in an English-speaking country. The classroom alone just wasn't enough to trigger the structural brain shift. It required the massive, relentless practice that only living in the language can provide. Now, for those of us learning in a classroom, that can feel a little deflating, right? But it perfectly sets up the need for a solution. Since we can't all just pack up and move abroad, let's look at everyday classroom solutions in Section 5, Collaborative Language Learning. To get that necessary processing speed in a normal classroom, teachers can use Paul Nation's 4 strands to balance a course. You need meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, language-focused learning, and, absolutely crucial for our discussion today, fluency development. A properly balanced class doesn't just teach new rules, it dedicates specific, carved-out time to making the rules you already know faster and more automatic. A great technique to proceduralize knowledge without totally boring your students to tears is iterative practice. Researcher Diane Larson-Freeman champions this. It means repeating a grammatical pattern, but changing the context or vocabulary every single time. For instance, instead of a robotic drill, students might do a fun ABC drill. They use a complex conditional sentence, but have to bring items to a party in alphabetical order, like an apple, a banana, a citrus. They're practicing the same difficult grammar loop over and over, strengthening those neural connections, but the creative, meaning-focused context keeps their brains highly engaged. And here's another huge piece of the puzzle. As researcher David Block points out, true fluency means we have to stop viewing language as some solitary information processing task and start viewing it as a highly social event. Learning a language isn't just a single brain interacting with a textbook. It's a shared social practice where learners co-construct knowledge and scaffold each other through interaction. Teachers can foster this shift by designing tasks with shared goals, both linguistic and non-linguistic. Like a model lesson by Dr. Cuneta, where students didn't just practice French food words, their shared non-linguistic goal was to research a website to figure out what healthy French people actually eat for breakfast. That creates positive interdependence. Or giving one blindfolded student directions to collect colored stones. These kinds of activities force rapid, spontaneous processing in a highly social context. So knowing that true fluency relies so heavily on procedural speed, massive iterative practice, and shared social goals, how might you restructure your own approach to mastering a new language today? Whether you're a teacher designing a lesson or a learner trying to finally break through that conversational wall, remember that knowing the rule is only the very first step. The real magic happens when you practice it so dynamically and so socially that your brain simply forgets to translate. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.